The conference room door slammed so hard the whiteboard marker rolled off the ledge. My manager stood there, face flushed, finger pointing at me like a loaded weapon. "Why did this explode on us?" she demanded, voice cracking with fury. I looked up from my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and said nothing. Because 2 days ago, she'd told me I was more obstacle than help. 2 days ago, she cut me from the escalation list entirely. Let me take you back to where this started. My name is Esra Moore, and I'm a senior systems architect at Horizon Technologies, a mid-sized cloud infrastructure company that serves about 200 enterprise clients. For 3 years, I'd been the go-to person when critical systems failed. Middle of the night? Call Esra. Weekend emergency? Esra's got it. Client threatening to leave because their entire payment processing went dark? Esra will fix it and smooth things over. I didn't just solve problems. I anticipated them, documented them, and built safeguards so they wouldn't happen again. My manager, Helen Voss, used to praise this publicly. Used to. 3 weeks before the explosion, something shifted. Helen started excluding me from architecture review meetings. She stopped CCing me on client escalation emails. When I asked about it, she gave vague responses about streamlining communication and reducing noise. I noticed she was looping in Garrett Fisher, a newer architect who'd joined our division 6 months prior. Garrett had impressive credentials on paper, an Ivy League degree and 5 years at a major tech firm, but he approached problems with a hammer when most situations needed a scalpel. He was confident, though. Exceptionally confident. The first warning sign came during a client presentation. Normally, I'd co-present with Helen, handling technical details while she managed the business narrative. This time, she brought Garrett instead. I found out when I saw the calendar invite marked optional for me. I showed up anyway, sitting in the back while Garrett presented slides containing my analysis, my diagrams, my recommendations. He delivered them smoothly with good polish. But when the client asked about failover sequences, he stumbled, gave a vague answer about redundancy, and moved on quickly. Helen glanced at me but didn't ask me to clarify. After the meeting, I caught Helen in the hallway. Why wasn't I presenting? She adjusted her portfolio, not meeting my eyes. We're giving Garrett more client-facing exposure. You've had plenty of opportunities. It's time to spread them around. Those were my recommendations in those slides. And they were excellent, she said in that artificial brightening tone. You should be proud your work is being used. But Esra, our division is growing. We can't have everything funneling through one person. It creates bottlenecks. I've never been a bottleneck, I said quietly. I've been the person who keeps things moving. That's exactly the problem. She stopped and turned to face me. You're so good at fixing things that no one else gets the chance to learn. We need to build capability across the team. The words sounded reasonable. But standing there, watching Helen justify why my expertise was suddenly a liability, I felt something crack inside me. Not anger. More like the quiet devastation of being reclassified without warning. The real breaking point came during a routine check-in meeting 2 weeks later. I'd flagged a configuration issue in our auto-scaling system that could cause cascading failures if traffic spiked unexpectedly. It wasn't urgent in the immediate sense, but it needed addressing within the next sprint before we hit quarterly peak traffic season. The configuration drift had been gradual, introduced across several incremental updates over the past month. Individually, each change seemed minor. Collectively, they'd created a mismatch between our load balancer thresholds and our container orchestration settings. Under normal conditions, everything worked fine. But if we got a sudden traffic surge, the kind we saw during product launches or promotional campaigns, the system wouldn't scale fast enough. Containers would crash under load faster than new ones could spin up to replace them. It was a classic cascading failure pattern, and I'd seen it destroy systems before. I walked Helen through it methodically. I showed her the configuration files, the drift analysis, the historical data from similar incidents at my previous company. I even built a simulation demonstrating how the failure would propagate. She listened for maybe 90 seconds before interrupting. You're always finding problems that aren't there, Esra. We need solutions, not more anxiety. The comment landed like a slap. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice level, professional. I understand that perspective, but this is a documented architectural flaw. If we get a traffic surge during the Crestview promotional campaign next month. If, Helen interrupted again, waving her hand dismissively. The gesture was so casual, so utterly unconcerned, that it actually took me a moment to process that she was genuinely not interested in the technical substance of what I was explaining. Garrett reviewed the same system last week and found no issues. Maybe you're overthinking this because you're used to being the hero. But we're building a team here, not a one-woman show. I felt something inside me go very still. Garrett reviewed the load balancer, not the auto-scaling configuration. They're connected systems. You can't evaluate one without. Esra. Helen's voice had shifted into that particular tone managers use when they've decided the conversation is over but want to pretend they're being patient. I appreciate your diligence. I really do. But part of growing as a senior engineer means knowing when to trust your colleagues and when to let things go. Not every anomaly is a crisis. Not every potential issue requires immediate action. We have limited bandwidth, and I need you to be more strategic about what you escalate. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd mentored half the engineers in our division, written most of our disaster recovery procedures, and established the incident response protocols that had kept our uptime at 99.97% for 3 consecutive years. And now I was being lectured about strategic thinking by someone who'd just dismissed a legitimate architectural concern because it didn't align with her preferred narrative. I nodded slowly, closed my notebook, and said nothing else for the rest of the meeting. What was the point? She'd already decided I was the problem. 2 days later, the email arrived. It hit my inbox at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday, which should have been my first clue that something unpleasant was coming. Subject line, updated escalation protocol, effective immediately. Helen had restructured the entire on-call rotation and emergency response tree. My name appeared nowhere on it. Not as primary, not as secondary, not even as a tertiary backup option. Garrett was listed as primary escalation contact for all critical incidents, with 2 junior engineers, Kyle Brennan and Sophia Lynn, as backup. I'd been completely removed from a system I designed myself 3 years ago. The email included a brief note at the bottom, written in that careful corporate language designed to sound positive while delivering bad news. Esra, we're shifting your focus to documentation and long-term planning. You're more valuable there than in firefighting mode. This will free you up to think strategically and contribute to our architectural vision without the constant interruptions of incident response. I read it 3 times, trying to parse the subtext beneath the sanitized corporate speak. Documentation and long-term planning were important, absolutely. But they were also where you put people you were quietly sidelining. Engineers who'd lost technical credibility. People being managed out. I'd seen it happen to others. I never thought I'd see it happen to me. I walked over to Helen's office, my heart pounding but my expression carefully neutral. She was on a call but gestured for me to wait outside. Through the glass wall, I watched her laugh at something the person on the other end said, her whole demeanor relaxed and cheerful. When she finally finished and waved me in, I didn't sit down. Is this about something specific I did wrong, or is this about Garrett needing more visibility? Helen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed in what I recognized as her defensive posture. It's about team balance, Esra. You've been carrying too much for too long, and it's created dependencies that aren't healthy for anyone. If you're always the solution, no one else grows. We can't build a sustainable organization around a single point of failure. I'm not a single point of failure, I said quietly. I'm the person who documents everything, trains everyone, and makes sure knowledge gets distributed. I've been trying to make myself redundant for years. That's what good engineers do. And yet everyone still comes to you first, Helen countered. Even when other people are on call, even when there are supposed to be clear escalation paths, somehow it always ends up at your desk. That's not sustainable. Because I respond quickly and I fix things correctly, I said, hearing the edge creeping into my voice despite my best efforts. That's not dependency. That's competence. Helen's expression hardened. That's exactly the attitude I'm talking about. This assumption that you're the only one who can do things right. It's undermining to your colleagues, and frankly, Esra, your tendency to catastrophize every minor issue creates unnecessary stress for everyone on the team. We need calm, measured responses to problems, not constant alarm bells. The issues I flag are real, I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. I have data to support every concern I've raised. Metrics, logs, historical precedent. Data can be interpreted many ways, she replied, and there was something almost pitying in her tone that made my stomach turn. Garrett interprets the same systems and sees stability. Maybe that's the mindset we need right now. Maybe we need someone who can reassure clients instead of making them nervous with worst-case scenarios. I wanted to argue. I wanted to pull up the incident reports from the past 3 years, to show her every disaster I'd prevented, every close call I'd caught before it became critical. I wanted to ask her what she thought would happen when the next real crisis hit and Garrett's reassuring confidence ran headfirst into technical reality. But something in her tone, in the set of her shoulders, told me this wasn't about evidence. This was about a decision she'd already made, a narrative she'd already constructed where I was the problem and Garrett was the solution. So I said the only thing that felt true in that moment, understood. She softened slightly, perhaps relieved that I wasn't going to fight harder. This isn't personal, Esra. It's about building a sustainable team structure where we're not all dependent on any single individual. You'll see, this is better for everyone in the long run. It'll reduce your stress levels too. You've been carrying the weight of this division for too long. I nodded and left, legs feeling disconnected. That was Monday. By Wednesday, I'd shifted to documentation and planning docs that would likely sit unused. I watched Garrett field escalations and incidents, basking in visibility that used to be mine. He was good at performance, confident emails, reassuring calls, always projecting control even when his solutions were surface patches rather than root fixes. The first incident was database connection pool exhaustion at Silverstone Analytics. Symptoms: slow queries, timeouts, locked out users. Garrett's solution: increase pool size, restart database. It worked immediately. Performance normalized, client was happy. He sent a triumphant email highlighting his quick fix. I noticed what he missed: the pool exhaustion was a symptom, not the cause. Somewhere in their code, connections weren't releasing properly. Increasing the pool just delayed recurrence. I started drafting a follow-up suggesting we review their connection management, then stopped. Not my problem anymore. I deleted the draft. 3 days later, Silverstone reported it again. Garrett applied the same fix. The third occurrence 5 days after that found the client less understanding. I overheard him explaining that databases just needed tuning sometimes. It wasn't normal. It was a code-level memory leak that would worsen until someone examined the application layer. I kept my eyes on my screen. The pattern repeated. A caching issue at Oak Ridge Media that Garrett resolved by increasing cache memory instead of fixing invalidation logic. Network latency at Pennington Industries he blamed on ISP problems when the real issue was inefficient data serialization creating oversized payloads. Each time, his solution worked short-term. Each time, the underlying problem waited to resurface. Thursday afternoon, Crestview Financial reported intermittent transaction slowdowns. Garrett took the call. I saw the Slack thread where he assured them it was temporary network issues, nothing systemic. He ran diagnostics, saw throughput had normalized, closed the ticket. I checked logs out of habit. The slowdowns occurred during mini traffic spikes, exactly what I'd warned about. Autoscaling wasn't provisioning containers fast enough because thresholds were wrong. It would worsen as traffic grew. I drafted a message to Garrett, then deleted it. Not my responsibility. I'd been told to step back. So I did. I closed the logs and returned to documentation for a migration 6 months away. Friday was quiet. Too quiet. Garrett left early for a dentist appointment. Helen seemed cheerful in stand-up. Great week, everyone. We're hitting targets and keeping clients happy. This is what good teamwork looks like. I smiled and nodded. The knot in my stomach tightened anyway. Saturday morning, I was at the Daily Grind coffee shop trying to enjoy my weekend with a book. The place smelled like espresso and pastries, sunlight streaming through windows. I'd just settled in when my phone buzzed. A message from Kyle Brennan. Hey Esra, sorry to bother you, but Crestview is melting down. Transactions failing everywhere, their CEO is calling our VP, and I can't reach Garrett. Do you know what's going on? I stared at the message, coffee growing cold. Every instinct screamed to jump in. But I wasn't on escalation. I'd been cut out deliberately. If I stepped in, I'd validate everything Helen said, that I couldn't let go, didn't respect boundaries, was an obstacle. So I typed, "I'm not on escalation anymore." Loop in Helen. She'll know how to proceed. Kyle's response came instantly, "I tried." She's not answering. Neither is Garrett. Esra, this is really bad. Transaction failure rate just hit 47%. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, then opened my laptop. Because whatever political games were happening at Horizon Technologies, Crestview didn't deserve to suffer. They were a client trusting us with critical infrastructure. They had customers trying to pay bills, send money to family, all hitting error screens because our architecture was failing. I logged into monitoring and my worst fears materialized in real time. The auto-scaling failure I'd predicted 3 weeks ago was happening at full scale, exactly as warned. Crestview was running a weekend promotion, double reward points, and traffic had spiked to 340% of normal. We should have handled this easily, designed for 500% capacity. But misconfigured thresholds meant the auto-scaling controller wasn't spinning up container instances fast enough. Containers crashed under load faster than replacements could provision. Transaction queues backed up into tens of thousands. Error rates climbed from 47% to 51% while I watched. The whole system was entering a death spiral. I spent the next 4 hours fixing it, fingers flying across the keyboard while my untouched coffee sat growing stone cold. First, I manually adjusted the scaling thresholds to match what they should have been all along, what I'd recommended in my original 3-week-old report. The changes were surgical, modifying trigger points, adjusting cooldown periods, recalibrating response curves. Then I restarted the load balancer with corrected configurations, carefully orchestrating the restart sequence to avoid making things worse during the transition. I gradually brought container groups back online one cluster at a time, monitoring each as it stabilized before moving to the next. Transaction queues slowly began to drain. Error rates dropped from 51% to 38% to 22% to 9%. By early afternoon, we were back to normal operations, the crisis averted through painstaking manual intervention. I documented every single step in a detailed incident report, comprehensive timeline, root cause analysis, remediation actions taken, and specific recommendations to prevent recurrence. I sent it to Kyle with clear instructions to forward it to both Helen and Garrett. Then I closed my laptop, stared at my completely cold coffee, and tried to salvage whatever remained of my Saturday. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability hanging over everything like a storm cloud. I got to the office 45 minutes early, expecting some acknowledgement of what had transpired over the weekend. Maybe a thank you for stepping in during a crisis. Maybe even an apology for the structural failures that had made my intervention necessary. Maybe at minimum a substantive conversation about how we'd allowed a critical system to fail so spectacularly. Instead, I got silence. Complete, deafening silence. Helen didn't mention the incident in stand-up. She ran through the usual agenda items, project status updates, upcoming sprint deadlines, team announcements, as if nothing catastrophic had happened 48 hours earlier. Garrett was back too, looking well-rested and completely unaware of the crisis he'd missed while presumably enjoying his weekend. He even made a casual joke about how quiet and smooth things had been lately. I kept my head down and worked on documentation, telling myself it didn't matter, that I'd done the right thing regardless of recognition or acknowledgement. Then, around 11 a.m., Helen's office door flew open with enough force that it bounced off the wall stopper with a sharp crack. She stormed across the open floor plan, heels clicking against the hardwood like gunshots echoing through the space, and stopped directly in front of my desk. Her face was flushed red, jaw tight with tension, eyes blazing with an anger I'd never witnessed from her before in 3 years of working together. Conference room. Now. Her voice cut through the ambient office noise like a knife, making several nearby engineers look up sharply from their screens. I followed her, heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, in my wrists, everywhere. When the door slammed behind us with a thunderous bang, she whirled on me before I could even fully turn around. Why did this explode on us? I blinked, genuinely confused by the question. I'm sorry, what exactly are you asking me? Crestview, she shouted, voice cracking slightly with stress. Their CEO called our VP at home. On a Saturday. Do you have any idea how catastrophically bad that looks? We nearly lost a multi-million-dollar account because our systems completely fell apart during their biggest promotional campaign of the quarter. I'm aware of what happened, I said carefully, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline flooding my system. I spent 4 hours on Saturday fixing it while everyone else was unreachable. She stopped mid-sentence, mouth open in genuine shock. Her anger seemed to falter, replaced by something between confusion and disbelief. You what? Kyle messaged me when he couldn't reach you or Garrett. The system was failing exactly the way I warned it would 3 weeks ago, so I logged in and corrected the configuration issues manually. I documented everything in the incident report I sent through Kyle. It should have reached your inbox Saturday afternoon. I pulled out my phone and forwarded her the report again. There. Send it directly to you now in case you missed it the first time. Helen's face went from red to pale in seconds. She pulled out her own phone, scrolling frantically through her email. I watched her face as she found the report, watched her eyes scan the detailed timeline, the root cause analysis, the exact configurations I'd changed and why. Her jaw tightened, but now it looked less like anger and more like someone trying to process information that didn't match their expectations. You were removed from escalation for very specific reasons, Esra. You had absolutely no authority to touch production systems without explicit approval from the current escalation lead. There was no one to approve it, I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady and professional. The chain of command you established was completely unreachable. The client was hemorrhaging transactions. Every minute of delay cost them money and cost us credibility and trust. What exactly was I supposed to do, Helen? Watch it burn while I waited for someone with the proper authority to maybe check their phone? You were supposed to respect the organizational structure. Her voice rose again, but there was something desperate in it now rather than righteous. We have protocols for a reason. The protocols failed, I said flatly. Your primary escalation contact missed a critical warning that I flagged 3 weeks in advance. Your backup contacts couldn't reach anyone with decision-making authority. The system I designed 3 years ago was failing in exactly the pattern I predicted, and no one with official authority was available to address it. So yes, I stepped in. Because someone had to. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. Garrett said the system was stable when he reviewed it. Garrett was wrong. I leaned forward slightly. Helen, he looked at surface metrics and declared everything fine. He never checked the actual autoscaling configuration. He never tested edge cases. He never ran capacity simulations. I did all of those things, showed you the results, and you dismissed it as catastrophizing. He has more experience in cloud architecture than. He has more impressive credentials, I interrupted, my patience finally fraying. That is absolutely not the same thing as having more experience. I've been running these specific systems, these exact configurations, for 3 solid years. I know every quirk, every edge case, every potential failure point. I've documented all of it. Garrett's been here 6 months and he approaches everything like it's a textbook problem with textbook solutions. Real infrastructure doesn't work that way. Real systems have history and context and accumulated technical debt that you have to understand deeply before you can modify safely. Helen sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs, the fight seeming to drain out of her. She rubbed her temples, looking suddenly exhausted. The VP wants a comprehensive postmortem. He wants to know why this wasn't caught during our review processes. He wants to know why our most critical client had a catastrophic system failure during their peak revenue period. It was caught, I said quietly, deliberately. By me. You just didn't want to hear it because it didn't fit the narrative you'd constructed. The silence that followed felt dense, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to fully acknowledge. Finally, Helen looked up at me. You're saying this is my fault. I'm saying you made a choice based on optics and team dynamics instead of technical reality. You wanted to elevate Garrett because he fit a certain profile. Confident, credentialed, assertive, the kind of person who makes executives feel good in meetings. I understand the appeal. But confidence without deep technical competence is just noise. And now we're both sitting here dealing with the aftermath of that choice. She flinched like I'd physically struck her. You think I don't know what I'm doing as a manager? I think you got sold a story about me being an obstacle who creates problems instead of solving them, and you believed it without really investigating whether it was true. I think you saw my warnings as anxiety instead of expertise. And I think you convinced yourself that replacing experience with charisma was a smart organizational move. I softened my tone slightly, because despite everything, I didn't actually want to destroy her. Helen, I've never wanted to be the hero who saves the day at the last minute. I've wanted to build systems robust enough that heroes aren't necessary. But when you cut me out and put someone in charge who doesn't have the depth of knowledge to catch what I catch, this is what happens. Systems fail. Clients suffer. And we all end up in conference rooms trying to figure out who to blame. Helen stared at the table for a long moment, her fingers drumming once, twice, then stopping. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, stripped of the defensive anger. What do you need from me going forward? To be listened to when I raise concerns, I said simply. When I flag an issue, it's not anxiety or catastrophizing or whatever label makes it easy to dismiss. It's pattern recognition built on years of data and direct experience with these systems. You don't have to act on every concern immediately. You don't have to agree with my assessment every time. But you do have to take them seriously enough to investigate rather than dismissing them out of hand. And you absolutely cannot shut me out of critical systems and then blame me when things go wrong because I'm not there to catch them before they become disasters. She nodded slowly, the gesture carrying genuine understanding. The postmortem is tomorrow morning at 9. I need you to present your findings to the leadership team. Will Garrett be there? Yes. So will the VP and probably a few other executives. And will you back me up when I explain what went wrong and why it happened? Helen met my eyes directly for the first time since this conversation started. Yes. I will. The postmortem meeting the next morning was tense from the moment I walked in. The VP, a silver-haired executive named Donovan Pierce, sat at the head of the conference table with an expression that could freeze water. Helen sat to his right, looking like she hadn't slept. Garrett was there too, along with our CTO and 2 other senior directors I recognized but rarely interacted with. I set up my laptop and walked them through the timeline methodically. I showed the warning I'd raised 3 weeks prior with full technical documentation. I showed Helen's dismissal of it. I showed the escalation restructuring that removed me from the response chain. Then I walked through the weekend incident itself, pulling up logs, metrics, error rate graphs, everything. The data told the story more clearly than I ever could. I showed how the traffic spike triggered exactly the failure mode I'd predicted, how the misconfigured auto-scaling thresholds created a cascading collapse, how transaction failure rates climbed past 50% before my manual intervention. Garrett tried to interject twice, claiming his initial assessment had been reasonable given the information available at the time, but I had timestamps showing he'd never actually examined the auto-scaling configurations. He'd looked at high-level monitoring dashboards, seen green status indicators, and declared victory without digging deeper. When I finished the presentation, Donovan looked at Helen with an expression that made her visibly pale. You removed your most experienced architect from escalation and replaced her with someone who missed a critical configuration flaw that she had explicitly documented and warned about. Is that an accurate summary? Helen hesitated for a moment, then gave a single nod. That's accurate. Why did you make that decision? I thought we needed to develop capability across the team and reduce dependency on a single person. In hindsight, the execution was badly flawed. Donovan turned his attention to me. You fixed this on your own time, off the escalation list, with no official authority to do so. Yes, sir. Why would you do that? Because it needed fixing, and no one else was available to do it. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. Esra, effective immediately, you're restored to the escalation list as primary contact for all critical incidents. Helen, you and I will have a private conversation about decision-making processes and how to properly evaluate technical versus interpersonal dynamics. Garrett, you'll work directly under Esra's supervision for the next quarter to properly learn our system's architecture. Are there any questions? No one spoke. Donovan stood and left the conference room without another word. Helen avoided my eyes as she gathered her materials. Garrett looked like he wanted to say something but decided silence was the better option. I sat there alone for a moment after they'd all left, feeling vindication mixed with bone-deep exhaustion. Later that day, Helen appeared at my desk. I owe you an apology. You do. I got caught up in trying to look like I was building a strong team, and I stopped actually listening to the team I already had. That was wrong. I studied her expression, searching for genuine remorse. I found it, mixed with embarrassment and what looked like actual regret. Apology accepted. But Helen, this cannot happen again. You don't have to take my word as gospel on every technical issue, But you do need to engage with the substance of what I'm saying instead of dismissing it because it doesn't match the narrative you prefer. Understood. She paused, shifting her weight. For what it's worth, you're not an obstacle. You never were. I just got threatened by how much the team relied on you. Then help me build systems where they don't have to rely on anyone that heavily, I replied. That's what I've been trying to do all along. She nodded and walked away. I turned back to my computer, where I was already drafting a proposal for automated configuration monitoring that would catch drift before it became critical. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being good at your job: people will resent you for it, sideline you for it, try to replace you with someone less threatening. But when everything falls apart, they remember why you were there in the first place. I'd been cut from the list, dismissed as an obstacle, blamed for raising concerns that turned out to be absolutely correct. But when the system failed, when it collapsed in exactly the pattern I'd warned about, I was the one who showed up. Not because I needed recognition. Because the work mattered. Helen learned that lesson. Garrett learned it. Donovan learned it. But the most important lesson was mine: you cannot control how people perceive you, but you can control whether you show up when it counts. And when that conference room door slammed and the question came, why did this explode on us? I had the only answer that mattered. I was right. I was there. That's not being an obstacle. That's being indispensable.